Okay, I will cut to the chase and begin in medias res. I think that there are so many things that I think I want to ask. It's not both of you, but you're representing two works or two practices here that I would like to ask to both of you when it comes to your specific practices. But I would like to try, let's see if it works, I don't know, to address some things that where your work intersects. So, we can kind of engage in a conversation about what we agree on or not, or, well, hopefully agree on. But nevertheless, in the beginning of your thesis, Eva, you quote Florian Kramer's declaration about the current state of artist books. And he says that artist books today tend to be a genre of graphic design. And graphic design here is used derogatory. The book reduced to graphic matter and the artist reduced to a designer, which obviously is a very reductive way of understanding graphic design, I dare to proclaim. Especially so when it could just as well be said that contemporary graphic design is as progressive and interesting as the artist books perhaps has ever been. But could we perhaps make some kind of clarification about the notion of graphic design here? Because I think it's kind of telling that this example uses graphic design as something derogatory in contrast to artistic practice.
Can I just make a very short clarification? The context from which I took this quote is that Florian Kramer is saying the artists, there are so many newly emerging artist book fairs, and it's become such a genre. And it's about making beautiful material books, because in a way everything moves online. So this engagement with material and with beauty turns this sort of this democratic and sort of revolutionary idea of what an artist book and what a book actually can do into the book becoming just a collectible. I guess that's the sort of context. So I feel uncomfortable and just wanted to clarify. But it's an interesting point you are making. I'm not sure that he is actually stating that design is less valued than artistic practice.
But there is a notion of graphic design that is contrasted to artistic practice, which is kind of interesting when it comes to your work. Perhaps you have any ideas about how you encounter this difference or the distinction, or is it even a question?
I think how I interpret your question is that you want to kind of highlight the tendency of reducing graphic design to this kind of conventional idea about organizing text and making beautiful layouts of already existing material, and that the designer is someone who always kind of responds to an author and provides services. And I think that's also something that a lot of I think that's a notion that is oftentimes reproduced within the design field as well, unfortunately. And I also think that what we share, the three of us in our group, and what we share with a lot of other people, of course, is that graphic design, because I think we all actually identify ourselves as graphic designers. I don't know, maybe you want to add something to that, but I do, and I've kind of insisted on doing so. Sometimes others would describe me as an artist or something like that, but I feel attached to the idea of being a graphic designer, but that's also because I have a wider concept of what it is to be a designer, a graphic designer, that includes a lot of practices and roles and questions that I think, Eva, you beautifully touched upon. Like the question of distribution, for example. Distribution is for me a very dear word that I think is manifested through how you engage with paper and printing and the making of books and fanzines and digital variations of such concepts. So yeah.
Yeah, I think what we are trying to do in a lot of our projects is to kind of shift, because what you're pointing to is the sort of graphic design scene as it's understood in maybe in a Swedish context, like the graphic designer producing beautiful books, going to book fairs, becoming a successful independent designer, maybe even starting their own publishing house and sort of reproducing beauty somehow. But we are trying to shift the spotlight to the working conditions of that designer, and also understanding how that designer role has been constructed throughout history. And that's kind of what we're trying to start doing with that book. And what we are finding in this book also, stories of graphic design work, graphic designers before it was called graphic design. Yeah.
And this shift of focus is basically a shift, if I understand you right, from what is being designed to design as the actual process, or what takes place in order for something to become a designed thing. But you have this key distinction. You make this key distinction between publishing as activity and as stabilization, where activities is basically a process, and stabilization is like an expanded notion of the material aspects of a publication. And what a main question here is, if I quote you, could practice itself be understood as a form of publishing, a teaching situation, for example? And considering what you just said, it's like, what happens if you substitute publishing here with design? Are our ways of thinking about design too concerned with the finite objects and less concerned with the actual process and the event that is taking place in order for something to, I don't know, is even artifact something that we should be focusing on?
No, it's not.
Yeah. It's a rhetorical question, of course, but I'd like to hear you expand on that.
And maybe it's important to, because there is also the discourse of like design thinking and focusing on the processes of design as design processes, and how do we sort of think, and what's the sort of intellectual behind the scenes of making a design work. But I think what was so interesting also with your talk is bringing in all the maintenance work and all the behind the scenes that is about material conditions and emotional conditions, and it's not about the artifact at all, I think.
It might sound contradictory what I'm saying now and what I said before, but I actually think the artifact can be a useful object when we understand it as an occasion or as a site to meet. Like, to have something to work on together actually helps a lot to crystallize ideas and to exchange skills and to interact with each other. I think the problem appears then when we start to fetishize this object and say, this is beautiful, this is the result, this is what we value, this is what you get your research points for, this is blah, 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 blah. And this is the sort of tipping point where it becomes problematic.
I totally agree. I mean, the object is very clearly situated in time and space, and that's the benefit of it in a way. And I think what you're saying is that we need to understand how we engage with the object and also kind of pay attention to the socialization around it. But I also agree with what you brought up, Sara, that there is also, I mean, what publishing and design have in common, like what these two concepts have in common, I think, is that there are notions of being, what do you say, obsessed is maybe an exaggerated word, but occupied about the end result in both fields. But there is also a discourse within design that is very much focused on the designing of the social relations, and I think I have problems with that too. It's also a bit, I'm thinking of like participatory design and these what is it called? Experience design and all these fields that are very much about designing situations. I think like the idea of paying attention to social relations and activities can differ and vary as well. But so I kind of think of the common ground in our practices. I think of the common ground in terms of like more being interested in the conditions of the practice and not necessarily the social activity as an end result in itself, which I think is also sometimes the case. At least in the design field.
Yeah, and there's a book to prove it. It's kind of remarkable that you really. I mean, how do you write a history that's not about finite objects or products? You have to work in another way. An oral history and oral accounts is obviously one important way of doing it. Is there what would you say is, since historiography is such a key thing for MMS, apart from collecting stories, what other kinds of writing and collecting and making visible aspects of history, visual history, are you working with or have you come up with? Or I mean, how am I going to go about to look like behind the objects that are like beacons within the linear traditional history?
I was going to say teaching or learning, maybe not teaching, because one thing we have done is a series of reading groups where we tried to go behind the object through reading and talking together, and trying to, in that way, trying to understand or trying to bring in texts that were not from the graphic design field, but a lot of the participants had experience as graphic designers, but creating an environment where people can share and learn together and focus on their experiences in the field or outside of the field.
Would it be okay to expand this question slightly?
Yes, very much so.
Because I mean, I'm super interested. You are in the book. You are sort of doing all this research about historic working conditions and thinking about our today's working conditions. How does the acknowledging that working conditions are important, how does this play with collective practice? How does this interrelate? Because I think there's a huge problem. We want to work collectively, and time is precious, and money is tiny. So how do we actually create conditions for collective work that everybody is paid? Because collective work is just expensive, because many people are thinking together, and this is a very different expense than when you traditionally say, let's say in a university context, you get the responsibility to teach this course, so it's your responsibility to teach this course, and you do it on your own, and you are paid a salary. Whereas when you start to open this up and invite more people, then everything gets sort of messy in a problematic way, because some people have the role and get paid, other people are not. How can we create methods to actually develop working conditions for collective work? Do you have any experiences, or have you tried, or how does it work in your collective?
I recognize that very well. I've been also engaged in other collective practices throughout the years, and that's one of like the reoccurring issues that you need to remind people that we're working collectively, we're more than one person. I guess we've been dealing with this issue in different ways. I think again the word distribution comes up for me, because it can mean different things, obviously, or take place in different ways. But the distribution of tasks, or like time between each other, is basically how you have to face the financial issue a lot of times, which means basically that perhaps you don't engage equally as much in the same task, but I think that's tricky as well, because oftentimes it ends up that you do engage as much, so you do and that's 3 times as much work than that you were asked to do. So it's a tricky question, but I would say that our book is actually not so much talking about the contemporary problems or working conditions, that it focuses on basically or mainly the time period between when the Bookmaking on the Distaff Side book was published, which is 1937, and then it goes to the technological changes around the 80s, so the moment of digitalization. And I would say that we have been investigating more contemporary issues more in other settings, as Sara was talking about, like in reading groups and in seminars and in teaching situations and things like that. Yeah.
But I'm wondering, maybe I want to ask back, or ask everyone, like if there is a difference between, or what is the difference between differences or similarities in identifying with a collective, or identifying collectively, or working collectively? Because I think what we are trying to do is also to trace identifying collectively, identifying with a collective that was, I think, more present in the 70s and 80s with the union organizing of labor, and identifying collectively today as a graphic designer, if we come back to graphic design, is I don't know, I'm not sure where it happens. Maybe it happens at the art book fairs where you meet other graphic designers. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's much more fundamental, because identifying with the collective means collectivizing resources. And there are people out there who do this, but this is like cooperatives, and it's doable, yeah.
But may I add something? Another thing that came to mind was that another response to the question that you posed is actually the question of authorship, I think, which you were talking about as well. And so earlier today we had a teaching session with students at Valand. Some of them are here. And the kind of framework that we presented for the workshop was who's holding the pen, and that's kind of a quote that we borrowed from Jess Baines, like one of our conversations with Jess Baines, who has been researching radical print shops in London, and she has also written a contribution to our book, but. She was telling us a few years back when we met her that that a lot of her interviewees who were engaged in radical print shops would testify about that they were confronted with the question, but who is holding the pen when they presented work that they had been doing collectively. And also one of the first seminars, or actually the first seminar we arranged was one at Konstfack about the book Historieboken, which is basically a counter-narrative to Western world history that was published by Ordfront in late 60s, or early, maybe it was, around the 68 movements, and that was also produced by 4 illustrators together. So it's, their work of illustration or like image making is completely intertwined. You cannot tell one hand from the other, so to say. And I think that what you pinpoint with this question of like how to encounter situations of like when commissioners and so on don't understand or don't have the capacity of actually understanding that you're a collective and kind of embracing that. It has to do with the same thing, that we're not trained to think of labor as collective, or there's always this gaze of like looking for individuals in everything. We're looking for names, we're looking for success stories, or like elevated names. So I think that's related to what you were talking about in your presentation.
Is there a difference when it comes to authorship compared to being accountable or accountability in relation to collective work?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, because of course this is the first sort of finger going up saying, but where is accountability? So I have this long chapter about it doesn't matter who is speaking, where I sort of go through the whole history of anonymous authorship and sort of collective pseudonyms. The pseudonyms, there was a really vivid movement in the 80s where people could publish under a collective pseudonym, so nobody knew who actually authored or wrote the text and the stuff. So it was all this, and anonymous in a way works in the same way. But then the following chapter, so this is called "It Doesn't Matter Who's Speaking." It's a Samuel Beckett quote. And the following chapter has the title, "It Does Matter Who Is Speaking." And in this chapter, I unpack, like from a decolonial and feminist perspective, that it is actually important that we know who speaks, because if we sort of say, oh, it doesn't matter, then we sort of buy into a certain universalism, which is often a Eurocentric universalism, and it might actually be really important to know which body and from which perspective somebody speaks. So that hasn't to do directly with accountability, but it has. I mean, it is to sort of pay attention that there are actually different contexts and different bodies who need to locate and situate their speaking.
So is it a question of when it is important? Or is it always a question of being prepared to take the stance of, yes, it is important who's speaking? Is it always important?
I think it's always important, because we don't want to buy into this idea of being universalist. But at the same time, and this is the dilemma, we are all longing for methods to not being the individual author, which then just feeds the system of audit and neoliberal quantification, so that everything can be quantifiable and say, okay, you have these 3 chapters. So that's sort of really difficult. How can we be clear about from where the subject writes or speaks, but at the same time not buy into this sort of quantifiable and measurable thinking?
But I think your thesis is a very good example of that. In several cases, when it comes to how you present your own authorship, how you work with collaborative writing, how other people are annotating your text, just the fact that you're using the wiki as the format for publication and dissemination of your thesis, and as as a scholar myself, trying to deal with the public management of peer review and publishing points, etc. It's extremely liberating to see a strategy that actually does something constructive with this situation. I'm more like Bartleby. I prefer not to, so I don't write. But or I don't publish, at least in that sense. But what do you see? I could see your thesis in this sense as a case study for how to publish academic work. Is that like how important is the fact that that the thesis is taking place within an academic realm?
it's an experiment.
Yeah.
And the experiment, like for me, and I make experiments when I'm stuck. I need to find ways out of being stuck. And because like all this research into the blockages and limitations and micropolitics and power politics of publishing, and then being aware that the thesis is a publication in its own right, it's impossible just to not acknowledge all the insights. I mean, I needed to find a way or to experiment with ways to do it differently.
And in relation to teaching, I mean, your advice to us as students or writers or people who are supposed to publish things, how do we negotiate with the given conditions that we are actually facing while working, while studying, while...
You mean in an academic institution, like the...
Mostly, yes, but I mean, the institutions are present us with a lot of with conditions, and but let's take the academic institution as an example. But I mean, you have the privilege of being a scholar within artistic practice, but as a student, for instance, writing a thesis, different kind of expectations, and I think, I mean, what is the, coming back to what you said about teaching, what are the important, what's most important when it comes to teaching these things to excuse me, to people in order to prepare them for dealing with these conditions?
That's a difficult one.
Yeah, but I mean, you can draw from your experience because teaching is important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. But teaching writing and teaching like academic writing in an artistic context, I don't know I don't know how to answer this question. I can just say one needs to keep to be experimental and sort of trying to find strategies to approach tasks which make sense to oneself. So if I see a problem, I need to address this problem and need to find a way how I can tackle it. But of course, there's another school which would say, okay, you need to learn how to do academic writing, how to have a claim and then a literary review. And I mean, this is all useful. I'm not against academic writing. But the blockages for me were in this thesis, for example, that all the practice projects were collaborations. And then it's me, my individual voice, who is sort of cementing and historicizing these collaborative practice projects. And that's a huge problem. So I needed to find a way how I can bring in these other voices. And this could happen through the wiki.
Yeah, through the wiki. Both of your works in different ways describe like a shift from male to female know-how and how this kind of follows technical advancement or technical development and as you say, and ultimately digitalization when it comes to graphic design. And it's striking how the accounts of skill sharing within publishing communities in the book and from your examples as well, but historically, like the skill sharing within publishing communities within a messy history of printing is kind of echoed much later in free software culture and that kind of radical publication. Like cross-reading your work is almost like you almost get the impression that free software culture is prepared within the messy history of women in printing and design. I'm not sure if that is the case, but it opens up like to me a very interesting way of looking at radical publishing today within a digital post-digital publishing, basically, and how it really connects to the collective situations that is described in your book. Please, can you expand on that idea? I'm not. Maybe what I just did was making a new kind of linear history, but which was not really my point here. But it's really striking how the similarities when it comes to sharing knowledge, sharing. I mean, how conditions for work and etc.
I could just give one anecdote, which is not really an anecdote, but I write about feminist technologies and open source technologies, and with a case study of Constant in Brussels, which is a feminist technology collective. And in an interview, Spider Alex, a Barcelona-based feminist technology activist, says that in French the operating system is called système d'exploitation, and she says actually, as a feminist, what you really want to do is to change your system of exploitation. Like, you want to be able to change the basics of what you are working with, and this is exactly what open source and open software culture allows for, and that's beautiful.
If I may make a comment that I don't know exactly how it ties into the question, but this came to mind, and it's about, like, I guess I want to go back to moments of technological development, and in particular, I think like one thing that we have been interested in looking closer into has been what actually happened during the times of when digitalization was introduced in late 70s and 80s, and how I think this is also something that, I mean, it's not being fully elaborated on in this particular book, but we have been writing about it in some other contexts, and it is basically it is how certain neoliberal political projects have been connected to technological development, and how this kind of creates an ambivalence about the role of women in technological development. To be more clear, so when digitalization was happening, a lot of women took the places of, like, former male print workers. So then it's two things happening, both that women enter certain, like, the professional field of printing and typography, but what is also happening is that there's a shift in these workplaces from a blue-collar identity to a white-collar identity. So it's also a shift that marks kind of, let's say, the end of identification as a worker. And this is also something that, of course, Ulla Vikander and Inger Humlesjö, who have been interested in exactly this shift, they present a critique of the trade unions, because, like, let's say the masculinity norms in trade unions, and how, like, the worker identity has been very much connected to male identity, which is also fundamentally problematic. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to bring up this kind of model and ambivalence also to nuance the history of technological development, and because I think if we have that in mind, it functions as a reminder of that. That technology is emancipatory in many ways, but it's also creating tensions, basically. Yeah.
Time flies. I think we should invite the rest of the room. You were always invited, but it's not that simple when you're sitting here with lights in your face. Questions, remarks, anything. You should definitely read the books. I make one quotation mark because it's not really a book in that sense, but it is a book.
It's a publication.
It's a publication,
yeah.
and it is publication as well.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to what you, Maryam, just talked about, the kind of complicated and then dialectical history about trade unions and masculinity, and going from blue to white collar, etc. I think that also Ingegerd Varanperä's story is kind of interesting as it complicates things a lot, where she tells the story of working with Ordfront in the early 70s, which was not what Ordfront is today. Basically, people making pamphlets on a farm, I guess. That's my picture of it in Småland, and with all the precarious conditions that comes with that. But then she describes leaving that milieu and getting a job at Dagens Nyheter, like the main newspaper, and that was actually a shift from bad working conditions to good ones, to no money to money, to from a male-dominated situation at Ordfront with the guys running things, to a situation where there were more women working, and especially where women were actually the ones who had the know-how when it came to the new technology, and that kind of complicates things. Perhaps it's also a reason to be wary of or critical about idealized distinctions between independent and institution, for instance, when it comes to oh no, it's behind there, it's fine. Collective, independent, corporate, independent, but actually this physical and personal movement from one place to the other actually gave her what the collective, independent situation didn't offer. Please, could you say something about that story? Because I think it kind of begs for an analysis, or at least some kind of rethinking about our ideas of being independent and the precariousness of this. And this is also where your book starts, with the question of contemporary precarious working conditions.
Yeah, I think what you're bringing out from her story is exactly what I was after about what I just said about the technological change and the tensions and the ambivalence of the position of women in that. I agree that it poses a lot of interesting questions, and just to thicken your account of Ingegerd's story, I think it's also important just to remind or to add that Dagens Nyheter, the newspaper that she starts working at
In the 80s.
in the 80s, was a huge, there was a huge, what do you say, struggle there. The union was struggling because they were, what do you say, kicking out people from the house. Again, a lot of male workers. And the organization was undergoing massive change. I guess in Sweden it wasn't, as far as I know, it wasn't as explosive as it was in London during the so-called Wapping dispute, which was was it 1 year or 2 years of massive protests against same kind of like reorganization of daily newspaper printing under Rupert Murdoch, who is still very active.
And they lost.
Person, yeah. The union lost. This was during Thatcher. So, yeah. So basically, in Stockholm, it wasn't perhaps as tangible. I don't know, but I think it's important to understand her story in relation to those events. So there's also, I read, for example, a book called Typerna och draken. It's written by, so basically, typographers and the dragon. And it's written as an account of the union representatives' struggle with Dagens Nyheter at the time. And again, it's a very male story. So there's also, again, there's reason to write a feminist account of what was going on then. Yeah, it's. But I agree. It's interesting. All of them, Ingegerd, Inger, Gail, and Megan, the former print workers that we've interviewed.
And I guess we have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Maryam. And there will be time for further discussion and drinks. There's like a hierarchy in this room because of this like elevation, and I feel it's appropriate to kind of get rid of this elevated position. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Nils.
you.